The title for our sermon today is Understanding Our Hunger. Now that comes from a conversation I had literally yesterday morning with another pastor, in which I said something that's perhaps a bit spicy, but I nevertheless feel convicted to be true. And I'll share it with you for context real quick, but what I said is this. I don't believe that in the West, in particular Canada and the US, many of us understand what it means to go hungry. Not only that, even fewer of us understand what it means to be desperate. Because especially in the church, if we understood what it means to be truly hungry, if we understood what it means to be truly desperate, we'd spend more time in working in a soup kitchen and food pantries than we do outside of abortion clinics. So the pastor sitting in front of me said, you know what, Lent is a perfect time for you to preach about that, so you should make that a sermon. Now, mind you, at the time I didn't know I was going to be preaching, so kind of funny that I got the chance. It was, what's that word, Jordan? Providential? It was providential, yeah. So, understanding our hunger. Why do we need to understand it? Because it is my belief, and it is our main point for today, that hunger reveals who or what ultimately meets our needs. I want to say that one more time. Hunger reveals who or what ultimately meets our needs. Now I'll share a little bit about my story, and hopefully I'll keep us short. Within the last 10 years of me here living in Calgary, there was a few weeks where I actually went hungry. We had to make the choice between being able to afford where we lived and eating. So we made affording where to live. And so for a few weeks, we ate very little, if not nothing. In church, it isn't pretty being hungry. Because while most of us have perhaps experienced good old hunger, we missed the meal and now we're angry and snapping at our spouses or friends. Real hunger starts like that, but it gets worse. Because then you get tired. Then your stomach seems to make noises that you didn't know it was capable of making. It hurts in ways that you didn't know it was capable of hurting. And that's just the start. Because then you get permanently irritable. You get tired. So all day you want to sleep, and when you finally get to sleep, when you get really hungry, you can't sleep because you're too hungry. You cry at everything that comes your way. If you see a picture of the most disgusting salad in the world, this suddenly looks delicious because you haven't been eating. And it keeps getting worse. If you take a medical perspective, it gets only worse from there. Now, usually people talk about hunger in terms of, it reveals who you really are on the inside. Well, I take a little bit of disagreement to that. I think hunger shows us what we can become. Because eventually, at the worst part of hunger, you get desperate. You start considering things, saying things, thinking things, and maybe even doing things that you normally wouldn't do because you are desperate. And for many people, especially for immigrants, many of which we get to receive here at church, it's in that moment that when they get the most desperate that they do one thing that most desperate people do. They cry out for help. And it's interesting in those moments to see who they cry out for help, because in those moments, the person who they usually cry out to is God. Whether they believe in him or not, whether they know him or not, they cry out to God. Why? Because they understand that they are actually incapable of fulfilling their needs. Maybe they have even tried and failed, and so the only thing that is left for them in their desperation is God. And I believe that we should understand what that means. So we are going to look at hunger in God. And we're going to be spending most of our day today in Matthew, so if you want to go there in your physical or digital Bibles, feel free to do that now. We're going to start in Matthew 4. Otherwise, it's actually behind me, so you can follow along. But this is what Matthew chapter 4, verse 1 says. Then Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. And after he had fasted for 40 days and 40 nights, he then became hungry. And the tempter came and said to him, "If you are the Son of God, if you really are God, command that these stones become bread. Use your power." But Jesus answers and says, "It is written, man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes out of the mouth of God." Now we're going to skip 4 verses here for the sake of time. And in verse 8, the devil comes in a third time now and says, takes him along to a very high mount and shows him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory. And he said to him, "All these things I will give to you if you fall down and worship me." But Jesus says to him, "Go away, Satan, for it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God and serve him only." And then the devil left him, and behold, angels came and began to serve him. So what do we have here? The fasting that Jesus did is not from social media, mostly because it didn't exist at the time, but he fasted from food. And he fasted for 40 days. Now, church, I went about 14 days without eating a lot. I ate a little. And I was going crazy. 40 days with no food is not nothing. He is hungry. And I'm not going to belabor this point, but just to remember what we learned a few months ago, Jesus is 100% human. So all those nasty little side effects I told you of hunger applied to him for 40 days. So in fasting, we get this hunger, this physical hunger. And we get desperate the longer we go. But it makes us aware of what we depend on. It makes us realize that we're not as self-sufficient and almighty as we think we are. Because guess what? You need air to breathe. Do you provide your own air? Can you actually manifest food in front of you at will? You think you can because you have money, but what if you didn't? You think you can if you have money, but what if there's no food? It makes us realize just how dependent we are on things outside of ourselves and how unable we are to procure those on our own power. Fasting, or going hungry, also causes us to understand who is the ultimate power in our lives. Who we go to in our hunger tells you who is it that really sustains you. And the other thing that I want you to consider is that when the hungrier you get, the more desperate you are. And the more desperate you get, what are you going to do then? What will desperation do to you? If you're fasting out of your own will, are you willing to say, "Oh, well, I made it 3 days, I'm going to eat bread now"? Because you're desperate. I don't feel well anymore, I'm going to just do this. That's mild. That's mild desperation. But what will it do to you? What will it make you consider? So when we look at Jesus in this particular case, as I said before, Jesus' hunger is real. At the end of 40 days, this man must be starving. He's probably emaciated and weak and dehydrated and probably not even able to move anymore. But what we see in Jesus is a dependence on God every step of the way. When the devil tells him, "You're God, you can make stones into bread. You could have done this already. Use your power to make yourself better." But Jesus says no, because that's not how it works. And then I want you to consider this, because I have read this passage 400 times, and probably so have you. And you've read the last part, and you're like, wow, devil, you're stupid. He's already King of Kings. Of course he's not going to take it. Except you're reading it while your belly is full. But now imagine yourself 40 days hungry and weak and in suffering, because you are suffering. And then this guy comes along and says to you, you know that cross you're going to have to go through in a few years? You know that suffering and humiliation, the constant infighting with your own people, and all these troubles that are coming your way on top of the hunger you currently have? I can get you to skip all that if you will just worship me. I can end your misery. I can give you the easy way out. Just worship me. When you're that hungry, when you're that desperate, that is a delicious invitation. But he doesn't. Lucky for us, he doesn't. Desperation plunges him deeper into the Father. Rather than compromise, he says, no, only God is to be worshipped and nothing else. So here's my challenge for us today. I have one. In this Lent season, in which we are already supposed to be fasting, are we willing to know practically what it means to be hungry, to experience hunger? And depending on how long you go, the despair that comes with it. My challenge, perhaps put into much, much simpler words, is I challenge you to fast in this season. You have about 3 weeks left in Lent. Now, I have nothing against fasting from things, like I said previously, social media, or only fasting from specific items in your life. That's fine. I'm glad that you're doing that. But the challenge I have for you is for you to go without food. The disclaimer I'll make is if you have physical challenges that preclude you from doing that, don't be reckless. And fasting might even mean that you can actually just go with bread and water. Trust me, I've tried it. It's plenty bad. But try it. Go hungry. And experience what that is like. I believe all of us should know what that is like. But we're going to move on to our next section, and we're going to go a little bit further down in Matthew to chapter 15. And we're going to see Jesus now a little bit, quite later actually, in a situation that involves something similar. Verse 29 says this: departing from there, Jesus went along the Sea of Galilee, and after going on up on the mountain, he was sitting there. He took his disciples with him, and he went to sit by the side of a mountain. And large crowds came to him, bringing with them those who were limping and had impaired limbs, were blind or were unable to speak, and many others. And they laid them down at his feet, and he healed them. So the crowd was astonished as they saw those who were unable to speak talking, those with impaired limbs restored, those who were limping walking around, and those who were blind seeing. And they glorified the God of Israel. Now Jesus called his disciples to him and said, I feel compassion for the people, because they have remained with me on this mountain now for 3 days and have nothing to eat. And I do not want to send them away hungry, for they might faint on the way. So here's what we see with this scenario. There's a question that arises for me last night as I was thinking about the sermon. How do we reconcile Matthew 4:4, which is, if you don't remember, is man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes out of the mouth of God, with this passage. Why does Jesus receive these people and doesn't go, let me give you this fancy papyrus with the Roman road? Why doesn't he go, let me teach to you for another 3 hours today as you're starving? He has says that the bread is not enough. The word is what gets you. And yet, when they get hungry, what does he do? He feeds them. Now, I don't necessarily have an answer for you because I haven't had enough time to think about it. But it's interesting, isn't it? How does Jesus respond to people's despair in this situation? Because again, I want you to think about who came to see him. In the, AD 30-something? The people that showed up are people who have physical ailments. They're missing legs or arms. They maybe have broken a bone and it didn't get set right, so now they walk weird. They're blind, or they can't talk, or they can't hear. Doctors can't fix it. The temple can't fix it. They've tried everything. They have a hunger for wholeness, but they can't find it. And so when they come to this man, again, Jesus just being a regular person in their eyes, who happens to be saying that he's from God, and he's starting to do things that we can't really believe, we're like, okay, maybe this guy can help me. I'll try anything. I know that the temple's where I should go, but I'm going to go to this guy on the side of a mountain, and I'm going to ask him, I'm going to beg him, help me. And his response is not to go, you need to read your Torah more. Spend some more time in prayer. His response is, okay, I'll heal you. And then I'm going to feed you. I'll hear you out. Because the needs that these people have come from hunger, church. They're not just physically hungry because they haven't eaten. They're hungry for more. Because they're missing something. Something's been broken. And what's beautiful to me is that Jesus' lack of sermon, Jesus' lack of paper or papyrus track results in verse 31, which I'll just go back just so that we can see it. They glorified the God of Israel. Now, I'm going to take a little break here, and I'm going to say this to you. If you're sitting here today being like, Eddie, what else do you want us to do? That's not the sermon today. The sermon today is actually a celebration. Because in this church, you care. Because the reason we were having the conversation about hunger and despair yesterday is because we are at the point, church, where agencies around the city are sending their hungry to us. And you know what the line is on most of the phone calls I get? I heard you guys are the church that helps. That's who we are known as. Not just in agencies around the city, but to people who, we give out cards that have our information. And we tell our clients, you get two. You get one for yourself and one for someone who needs it. And people call us and they're like, someone told us that you can help me. And they walk away knowing that we will help them. And if we can't, in what the specific, we send them to people that can. That is who you are, church. That is what your donations have accomplished. That is what your prayers have accomplished. That is what your dedication to the benevolence program, which is today is actually the day of, has accomplished. People that come here literally say, we praise God for you. We thank God for you. You, church, have done this. It is your love and your care that have accomplished this. And if I may be a bit pastoral in this moment, it is my belief that it is God who has done that through you. So rejoice. Rejoice because we're on the right path. Be encouraged. We've responded well, and people are having the right response. They're praising the God who as apparently here. So what does that mean for us then? Going back to our sermon. What does these passages in Matthew mean? It means that as God's people, we ought to know what it is like to hunger and despair. Jesus knew, our master knew. Is a servant greater than his master? No. So if Jesus knew what it was like to hunger for 40 days, or at the very least, he knows what it's like to be really hungry. So should we. It means that, like Jesus, we have compassion on those who come in despair to us. Why? Why would we do that? Because we understand, church. The church is a place where we understand the reality of this dark world, but we also have tasted personally the goodness of the next. The reality of the kingdom that our actions bring. The compassion that Jesus would extend. We have received it and we extend it. The people of God know who they call to in their desperation. We don't go, this get-rich scheme is going to save you. We don't go, this program is going to save you. Ultimately, it is God who hears you, who is at work through each one of us to make this world into the kingdom. When we face desperation, we don't despair, we call out to God. It doesn't mean that a Christian is never despairing. You know, like, I know it sounds like I said that, but that's not what I'm saying. But it means that in your despair, you don't lose hope. You trust in God, and you don't trust in Him, you trust in His people being at work. And we know, much like Jesus did, to meet more than just one need. Because the God that says, man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes out of the mouth of God, is the same God that says, these people haven't eaten in 3 days, they need food. These people are sick, let me heal them. Without exchange, without selling gospel or kingdom. He just does it. Hunger reveals who or what ultimately meets our needs. When we experience hunger, we go to God. We understand that we are dependent. Now, this world doesn't like you to be weak. The world doesn't like us to just be like, oh, I can't really do much for myself. But in the kingdom, the last is first. The weak is strong. The dependent is not weak. The very breath we draw, even in this moment, as I'm saying it to you, the breath that you draw without thinking, it's a gift. Now, I told you about the time that I was hungry. And we were really hungry, church. It was really hard. But we had a ray of hope during our week on Wednesdays. Because I think we got to the point where we were just eating one meal a day. But on Wednesday, we had small group. It was part of a church plant that I was with at the time. And so every Wednesday, we got a little happy because it meant that dinner was going to be substantial. Because everybody would bring food, and we would all share. What was special about that is they didn't know we were hungry. We didn't tell them. We were too proud. And we spent whatever little money we had to bring whatever tiny salad we could afford from Co-op. But they didn't know they were blessing us. They didn't know how hungry we were, but when we got there, we were fed. And our hunger wasn't just for food, it was because we felt alone. But in those moments, we met with people that cared to hear how we were doing, cared to spend time, cared to laugh with us and cry with us and pray with us. And that's just the level of blessing we can be. Because I can tell you now, having gone through that, if somebody says to me, I'm hungry, I don't go, you should try these things. I'm like, here's the food. Hunger is brutal. But in this table in front of me today, there is power. There is power, church. So here's my encouragement. Why did I finish the story? Because as we understand hunger, as we know what it is like, what ends up happening is that you become more like Jesus. Because Jesus understood hunger, and because he knew it, he experienced it, he responded in unique, compassionate ways. So if you're like, Eddie, I don't know if I really want to fast, this week we are having a family dinner and I'm going to miss it. Next week you'll have a birthday. Next week, trust me, there's never a good time for a fast. Do I really need to? No, you don't. Suppose you don't. Fasting doesn't save you, church. It just makes you more like Jesus, which is a desirable trait for people that carry his name. But if you do, if you take the journey, if you know what it's like, then you will be a bit more like Jesus, not just in his understanding, but in the way that he acts towards those who are desperate, because you know what it's like. It's a transformative practice, fasting. So that's my encouragement. It's not just to put you guys through hunger and leave you there. No. There's Jesus on the other side of that. Deeper intimacy with God. And I'm going to get the worship team to come up. And we're going to transition now to communion. It's interesting how Jesus uses food as a means to gather, as a means to heal, as a means to remember. At the end of John, following his crucifixion and resurrection, Peter and the disciples are feeling a little bit under, because Peter, more than most, had committed a bit of a blunder when he rejected his teacher 3 times in public. So he's not feeling great about it. So he goes out fishing with some of the disciples, and he spends a terrible night catching nothing. So he's probably hungry at this point, ironically enough. Hungry and tired and frustrated and guilty. And so Jesus shows up on the beach, and he's like, hey, young fishermen, y'all should just throw your tent on the side of the boat, on the other side of the boat. And Peter, probably really annoyed, goes, okay, old man, sure. They don't recognize him. And then they catch a lot of fish, and they're like, oh my gosh, it's Jesus. And he jumps off the boat, and he goes to meet him. And when they show up holding this, 150-some fish, Jesus is like, take some of those and bring them over here. And then we get to verse 12, and it says this. Jesus said to the disciples, come and have breakfast. Not, y'all need to repent. Not, y'all are inferior human beings, sinful and destructive in every possible way. No, he says, come and have breakfast. Now, none of the disciples ventured to inquire of him, who are you, knowing that it was the Lord. They just know. So Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and the fish likewise. Be like that small group, church. Give food because you don't know who's hungry. Host because you don't know who's homeless. Give because you don't know who's needing. extend the bread like Jesus does. Because here's the beautiful part of the story. I'm going to get my volunteers to come up for communion. After he gives them food, after he's met their most immediate need, this is what Jesus does. He says, Peter, do you love me? I'm not going to go through the whole text, but the point is, Jesus restores Peter. Because Peter was hungry for more than just food. He needed a word. He needed forgiveness. And that is what you find in this table today. Communion. Not just with God, which is wonderful and perhaps could stand on its own, but you need communion with one another. There's a reason we take together and not just the moment you get it. Because in this moment, you come around a table, and much like I did at the small group, you find yourself feeling your needs together. So I'm going to get you guys to pass the bread now.